Hi guys. Yeah, I think we're gonna get far more into the content today. I hope you have done a little bit of back reading, back notes on the chapter so far. Last week we did mostly marking, but we did cover the first two sections of reproduction. We had a look at asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And now we're going to be moving on to sexual reproduction in plants and sexual reproduction in plants continued and sexual reproduction in humans and sexual hormones in humans and sexually transmitted infections. So we are hopefully going to be finishing off the reproduction chapter today. There's a huge amount to cover. So bear with me. I'm going to try make sure that I cover it all. But yeah, I'm hopefully I'd like to get some feedback from you on Thursday. Probably not face to face, just because I don't have internet just yet. So maintaining that kind of connection is going to be a little bit crazy. But let's see what we can do. And without further ado, let's carry on. Okay, we're going to start with sexual reproduction in plants. Now, what is important to know about most plants is that they are hermaphroditic, or I've never heard it referred to as bisexual in these terms, but hermaphroditic is more apt because each little flower actually contains both the male and the female part of the sexual organs as far as that. Got your stigma, that's attached to your ovary, and that's kind of like the female part, and your anther and anther filament, which is your collectively known as your stamen. That's kind of like your male part that produces the pollen. So in most angiosperms, most flowering plants, you have a combination of male and female plants. This isn't the case for all flowering plants. Some flowering plants will only produce a male part, or a male flower or a female flower. But yeah, we pretty much are only going to be discussing this hermaphroditic sort of setup that has both male and female parts. Okay, so this gets into it in like a lot more detail. Please, by all means, give it a read. I'd recommend that you, after we've done this video, just take the time and just read through each one of these sections. I'm not going to sit here and read each little section because there's a huge amount to cover, and I want to get as much done for you guys as possible and sort of push you in the right directions. But definitely go have a read. It's very interesting, but ultimately it's just going to take a little bit too much time for me to read everything. But yeah, anyway. So flower structures are pretty important to know of for your tests and your exams. This diagram here kind of has the most detail that you're going to need, as long as you can identify your stigma, identify your ovary. Ovary can also actually be a lot lower down in your plants. So your stigma is all the way up here, and your ovary is generally this little bulb at the bottom here. So just keep an eye out for that, because ovary being all the way up here is not necessarily normal. But yeah, being able to say what your anther and your anther filament is attached to, and then that all collective being known as the stamen, as your male reproductive organ, and your stigma and your sometimes your ovaries separately, or just being able to call it a stigma alone, is your female parts of your flower. And then your petals and your sepals just being there to either advertise or protect the flower. Your nectar, it's going to be coming from here, and it's going to be that little sugary reward for your insect pollinators, or even sometimes your larger pollinators, depending on what your plant is targeting. But yeah, if you know these diagrams, I think you will be fine with everything that's going on. Yeah, the next little section here just breaks down what the function of each one of these parts of your flower is for. And it starts over here with your petals being there to sort of attract your pollinators to the flower to encourage pollination. Then sepals, they're mostly there just to protect the flower as the bud is emerging. Your stamen, that's there for, that's the male part of your flower. So it's there to hold up these little pollen anthers, where all your pollen is produced, and allow for those pollen sacs to distribute their pollen as the pollinators come in and investigate. Your pollen, your pollen is there. That's basically like the sperm in your flowers. It's the male reproductive gamete, and it can either be transported from one flower to another through wind or through the use of a vector, like a little insect pollinator or something a bit larger like a bat or a bird that comes to drink nectar from the flower. Pollen can also be collected by bees as a protein that they feed to their larvae. So your plant does kind of sacrifice a little bit of its pollen to bees, but in the process of that sacrifice, it is still ensuring that its pollen is getting from one flower to another. Okay. Then you got your carpels. Yeah, your carpels are the female reproductive organs. So when I was referring to your stigma and your ovary, that whole structure here, like this whole thing here, is referred to as your carpel. Okay. Then that's got as it says here, it's the female reproductive organs part of your flower. Okay. Yeah, it does go into a bit more detail here. Your ovule, which you can see, it's when your ovary now develops into your ovule. In this case, your ovule is a little bit below your flower, which is generally the case. You're normally going to see fruits and everything developing below this, so that this ovary isn't necessarily in the middle of your stigma. Okay. That ovule actually will become a seed, and the whole ovary will become a fruit that normally surrounds the seed. If a fruiting body is how this plant has decided to distribute its seed. Sometimes it just becomes a seed. Sometimes the ovary does develop into fruit, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's just a seed that then gets distributed. Okay. Your receptacle, it's the flower structure just described as it's where everything attaches to. It's just sometimes it develops into something, but most of the time it's just there to sort of hold everything in shape. Lupin flowers, this is just like a type of, I think it's a type of legume, so it's like a type of bean. This has a very specific inflorescence, which is flower shape. Yeah, but it's more common to see something that looks a bit like a hibiscus as far as like how you're going to be tested on labeling these different figures. Okay, so have a look. I want to make sure. So all of these parts, as long as you know the names and the functions of these parts, that's fine. But this is a very common one for them to be able to ask and know what the male parts are, know what the female parts are, and know what the function of each one of these structures is. Okay. There we have a look at the process of pollination. I don't want to see. Doesn't look like there's a table that breaks down this, but there is a table that breaks down pollination very, very well. So for the table that they refer to here about the functions, refer to each one of these little paragraphs here. Okay, as long as you know these paragraphs, I think you will be all fine. But back to pollination. Pollination is, as it is stated here, is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Okay, So you can have self-fertilization in some plants where you have a flower sort of pollinating itself, but the ultimate goal is to have a little bit of variety. So have pollen from another plant come to your plant, and that's not always, it's kind of a hard process for something that can't move around. So they employ the use of insect pollination or wind pollination. Now, insect pollination is kind of like, in this context, is speaking about vector pollination in general. There are many cases where you have the primary pollinator of some proteas, being little mice or little sugar birds, lots of different things. It doesn't only have to be insects, but in the way that we talk about it, it kind of occurs in the same process for most of these different types of pollinators. So here they talk about it just as a bee, that when it lands on the flower, it's, in this case, it'll push down the petals and get some pollen stuck on the underside of its body. Now, as I've said before, bees are actively trying to collect pollen on their visits to flowers as well, because the pollen gets all caught up on their knees here, and is actually what they feed to their developing young. The nectar that they feed on is, and what they turn into honey, is kind of what the adults will eat once they have finished with their metamorphosis. So yeah, the bee isn't going to be only collecting the nectar. It's also very much going to be collecting the pollen to feed its young. But the flower produces enough pollen that it has enough to be able to transfer from one flower to another, and still enough for the bee for it to be worth the bee traveling from one flower to another to collect this pollen. And as it moves from one flower to another, it takes the pollen and then eventually distributes it onto the stigma of another plant, and that little pollen grain that is now attached to the stigma grows down. I don't know if there's a good picture of it in here. It doesn't look like it, no. But the pollen granule actually sends down this little arm all the way down from the top of the stigma, all the way, so it might get stuck here, and it sends down this little kind of root all the way down into the ovary, in this case all the way down here into the ovary, where it fertilizes the ovaries, the little ovules, and those then develop into seeds and start the process of fruit development, depending on what kind of plant the bee has pollinated. So here you're using a little vector, in this case a bee, to come to your flower and take it to another flower so that you can exchange pollen, basically. Where with wind pollination, the emphasis is on wind being able to transfer your pollen from one plant to another, and in this case it's normally you have quite like they do a nice little look at how the different pollens themselves differ in this table down here. I think we've gone past it, but they talk about that these pollens are generally less sticky. There's far more of this pollen that's produced because you can't rely on an insect picking it up and moving it to another flower, so you have to produce way more of it so that there's the chances are high enough for wind pollination. But looking at the adaptations, they break it down very, very nicely in this table, where they have a look at the petals, the nectar, the stamen, and the stigmas and pollen, and the brackets, the modified leaves of each of these, in the aspects of each one of those structures in the context of insect pollinated and wind pollinated flowers. So for instance, for petals, for an insect pollinated flower, it's incredibly important to have very large, very colorful, nicely scented petals that will kind of attract your insects to your plant. Whereas for wind pollination, they don't expend any energy in petals, because that's just energy that it would be wasted if you're now making this big flower and then you're going to be wind pollinated. Nectar is another one where Your insect pollinated species, they put a lot of energy into producing nectar that will attract insects, while wind pollinated plants just don't put that kind of effort in. Your stamen, it's present inside the flower because you kind of want the insect to crawl into the flower and place the pollen on, will get pollen from there and also be able to pollinate the stigma. Where for wind pollinated plants, it's everything is sort of hanging out there. It can't be enclosed in a nice little space because then pollen might not be distributed evenly and it won't be as effective. Okay. And then pollen, your insect pollinated grains, when you look at them under a microscope, they're covered in little spikes, which make them a whole lot stickier and easier to stick onto insects as they pass by, whereas wind pollinated grains are smoother and they're a bit lighter and they're more easily carried by the wind. Brackets, which is like a modified leaf at the bottom of your plant, it's absent in insect pollinated plants and sometimes present in wind pollinated plants, but I've never seen that in one of the exams. Brackets, so I wouldn't stress too much over that. But this has popped up a lot as like you are asked how a flower adapted to insect or wind pollination might differ from a flower that's presented, or it might ask you to identify whether or not a flower is insect or wind pollinated based on some of these descriptions. So yeah, this is an important table for plant sexual reproduction. Okay, so just make sure that you get a good look at that. Fertilization, I think we've spoken about it before. It's just the same as in animals or plants with any kind of sexual reproduction. Fertilization involves the meeting of two gametes to form a zygote, and that zygote then undergoes division and then growth into a fully formed embryo, which then grows into a fetus at the end of the day. I don't think germination was something that, cross-pollination. You don't need to cover germination. Oh, wait, let's just be structured a bit different. Growth pollen tubes, entry and required environment conditions. Here, for germination, it's just more about like the environment that you're going to need for ideal germination. So here, why is water important for a seed? All of these, but this has popped up, like why is water important for germination? How is oxygen used? Because for the first part of germination there is no photosynthesis happening. It's only respiration. So it's using that energy store inside of its little seed aerobically. It needs oxygen. And the importance of temperature. It is a bit variable depending on the type of seeds that you've got, but generally most chemical or biochemical reactions, they happen more quickly the higher the temperature, to a certain degree. Like anything above 45 and the enzymes in the cells will denature and then the process stops, but all the way sort of up until 40 degrees, that increased temperature is only going to help the seedling or the embryo to develop more quickly. Again, not a one size fits all. Some plants are a little bit more sensitive to temperature than others, but as a general rule of thumb, higher temperatures increase the rate of growth. Germination and light, we had a look at that where, like I was saying down here, the use of oxygen, that shift between germination and like vegetative growth, it is important that light is present semi early on, else you get elongation and then they don't develop as naturally because you have this retention of growth using aerobic respiration rather than using photosynthesis, and so light is always important for that. Dormancy, Um, in unfavorable conditions, your seeds do have the ability to remain dormant or like in a state of low or near zero metabolic rate, which allows them to kind of wait until the conditions are right for the plant to develop. A lot of seeds actually have a chemical timer that they might need to be in a certain amount of almost freezing conditions where they wait just below the surface for that temperature to slowly start to rise, and only then will start to germinate. You might see this like as an example. Some people might need to put like eucalyptus seeds into the fridge for 3 months, and that simulates winter. And then once you take them out, they will germinate. But if you don't do that step, the seed actually refuses to germinate because it is kind of waiting for winter to still happen. So very interesting part of plants and even some animals that undergo periods of reduced metabolic rate, and how light, how temperature, and how all of these environmental factors actually influence how they interact with the environment. It is quite interesting. Okay, practical work conditions for seed germination. It's now just going through these three necessities: the importance of water, oxygen, and temperature on seeds, and seeing how those variables might influence the germination of seeds. So in this case, we're looking at like the quantity of water. So you've got peas soaked in a dry wool, soaked peas in a dry wool cloth, soaked peas in a wet cotton wool. So this is probably the one that's going to do best. C, there's a little bit too much water, so they probably aren't going to do so great. But it's important. Water is always an important thing for these reasons listed here. Please don't negate like skipping out on the little bullet points here. They are very important. The need for oxygen. So here they've got a setup where pyrogallic acid and sodium hydroxide solution and sodium hydroxide, and they've got moist cotton wool and cress seeds. So it's like those little seeds that grow on pretty much anything. So yeah, read it properly. So you're there, so that the cress fastening is there. So its source generation takes place in experiment conditions. Provided oxygen is present. Yeah, so the one with pyrogallic acid, I think, let me get this completely correct before I tell you nonsense. The main difference between this flask and since the seedlings in this flask, since in flask A, they don't have any oxygen. The pyrogallic acid and the sodium hydroxide absorb oxygen from the air, so the cress seeds in flask A are deprived of oxygen. So this combination of the two, pyrogallic acid and sodium hydroxide, removes the oxygen in the air for this test. And in the presence of just hydrogen, sodium hydroxide, I assume they leave it just in there so that you know that it's not the sodium hydroxide that is not allowing the seeds to emerge. Oh, sorry, germinate. So you should see that the seeds in flask B will germinate, while the seeds in flask A will not. And temperature germination, just having different temperatures, growing or trying to germinate seeds at different temperatures, you should see that the seeds with a slightly higher average temperature tend to germinate more quickly up until that ceiling of 40 degrees Celsius, because after that then things start to denature. It will be detrimental. Okay, so controlling variables, this is just an extension of that, like having a look at how you can control these different variables in test conditions or even for agricultural purposes. Yeah, and how you might control these things to increase germination or decrease germination. So just have a look at that a little bit more carefully. Self and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from an anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or a different flower on the same plant. So that's self-pollination. Whilst cross-pollination is then obviously the transfer of pollen grains from one anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower on a different plant or of the same species. Okay. So yeah, this is, as we were talking about the asexual and sexual reproduction, your plant is hoping for some cross-pollination. Well, because self-pollination, even though it's easier to do, it comes with some significant drawbacks as far as like your genetic variation for the next generation is concerned. So a plant is hoping to get some cross-pollination going, but is able to self-pollinate in sort of certain conditions. This is what I was talking about when I said that the in fertilization, the formation of this pollen tube, where this pollen grain, it sends down this long pollen tube, like relatively, like it's probably like not very long, but relatively speaking, this thing is growing out of a tiny itty bitty little pollen grain all the way down into one of your ovules, where it then fertilizes the female nucleus, and that's where a seed is formed and sort of generates this growth of a fruit around the seed, if that is what the plant chooses to do with its hormones. Okay. Fruit and seed formation. So this is just an extension of that. We don't go into a whole lot of detail about like why your fruit is produced, but it's basically the fruit is there to help with the spread of seeds. So if your seeds are all chock-a-block in this nice bright red fruit, it's there to attract an animal to come and eat it and poop out the seeds, and then that can help with distribution and can help with the growth, because now it's got a nice little mound of fertilizer wherever it lands. That is generally the reasoning behind fruit, is that you're looking for an organism to come and eat your seed and poop it out somewhere much further away to help with dispersal. Okay. For these guys, that this is just showing you what is involved with whatever's in a seed, and like where your energy is stored, your cotyledons, and where your radicle, which is basically your plant embryo, actually sits in your seed. Okay. Now, please, I have gone through that relatively quickly. Please make sure that you go through this section here and see, maybe I've missed something. I tend to do this when I'm moving through these sections so quickly, but have a look for yourself. Make sure that if there's anything that isn't clear, that you do message me about it. Then sexual reproduction in humans. Okay, which is kind of the same in most animals, most vertebrates. It's kind of pretty much the same. You've got your version of plant gametes, which are your ovum, your little egg cell, and your sperm. Once again, you know that when they meet, they form a zygote, which then slowly develops into an embryo. And yeah, the production of sperm cells. And let me actually just see what I should be focusing on. State the function of the following parts. So in your male and your female body, so for males, being able to identify and give the function for the testes, the scrotum, sperm duct, the prostate gland, and urethra and the penis. And then for in your female diagrams, you've got your ovaries, oviduct, uterus, cervix, and vagina. Okay, so we're starting with a zygote, which is a combination of the two. In humans, the male produces millions of sperm, while the female produces a small number of eggs, usually one a month for 40 years. Interesting fact: you, as a woman, you are actually born with all the eggs that you will ever have. They aren't produced month by month; they just sort of become ready once a month. And sometimes you can have one egg coming down the oviduct or 2 eggs. It can be a genetic reason, or it can be induced by a type of birth control or birth enhancing medications where you release more eggs than usual. But it's usually just one egg that comes out of one of your oviducts every month. To bring the sperm close enough for the ova for fertilization, this is copulation. This is what the vagina can be used for and the penis can be used for. And at the end of the day, it's just to ensure the meeting of your two gametes in the oviduct over there. Okay. Yeah, so these diagrams have a lot more going on than what is necessary for you to know. So please refer back to your syllabus just to make sure that you aren't overlearning all of these different parts of the male and female reproductive organs. At this stage, it is just the female reproductive organs. Here's the male reproductive organs. Yeah. So maybe let me run through. You've got a nice little sort of summary of each one of these parts. So I would say just know these. So if you've got your your female reproductive organ, you've got your cervix, your funnel of oviduct. Oviduct is more than fine. Funnel of oviduct. Okay, maybe it's not mentioned in your syllabus, so don't worry about your funnel of oviduct. Your oviduct is more than enough. So just take the time to just learn the ones that you need, and this is as detailed as for function as you need to go at this stage. And then you've got your male reproductive organ, pretty much the same breakdown, way over describing all of the different parts and components. And then it comes down to this, and you can just learn the summarized parts and functions. So here. Jimmy. No, I don't know who that is. Okay. Production of gametes. So sperm production, as we've said earlier, your male body produces millions of sperm every day, while your female produces. They don't produce any more eggs than what they were born with, but they will. One of those eggs will become ready for ovulation. On average, about one egg every 28 days. Okay. And yeah, as it's shown through here, there's a section through your sperm producing tubules. They lie on over here in this epididymis, where the sperm are stored, and in your testes, that's where they're produced. Whereas in your ovary, your not quite ready eggs are just sort of lining the edges of the ovary, and then as they become ready for ovulation, they move down your fallopian tubes and into your uterus. But fertilization still occurs within your fallopian tube, your oviduct. Okay. Mating and fertilization. Yeah, it's just I'm not going to go into it because I'm quite sure you guys are well aware of the whole process. And if you aren't, please give this a read through. The fertilization and the processes that occur after that is far more complicated and of more importance at this stage. So yeah, as we've spoken about like fertilization before, you've got your sperm cells coming up here and fertilizing one of your egg cells, and those egg cells then become a zygote, which then starts to sort of divide within itself, not getting any bigger, but becoming more complex, and that little embryo then moves down your ovarian duct and implants itself into your uterine lining, where it then settles in, develops a placenta, an amniotic sac, and starts to develop into a fetus that will then eventually become a baby. Okay, all very, very basic, but that's the short of it. Now we get into a more detailed look at what is going on. So as I mentioned before, we've got our placenta that we should be speaking about before we start talking about our amnion and our amniotic fluid. But the placenta is it's actually a better picture in the little kids' textbook, so I'm just going to go there. Here's the setup for how the baby's growing. You've got your placenta up against the uterine wall, and it basically becomes a connective tissue that allows blood to transfer nutrients and oxygen into the baby's blood, and then gets recycled and the toxins start to come out here as well. And it allows for the exchange of all these things without there actually being any mixing of blood. It's not your mother's blood that was flowing through you. It's still your blood, but your blood is so close to each other that it can swap all the nutrients one way, all the toxins the other way, all the oxygen one way, and all the carbon dioxide the other way. So yeah, there's no mixing of blood at this stage. It's just it's allowing for your mom's blood and your blood to communicate and share resources, basically. Okay, so this is a bit of a nicer picture than the one that's here. I mean, you can see the placenta over here a bit more nicely, but it's not as clear. I thought it'd be easier. Anyway, and then so that's the placenta is the thing that is allowing for this transfer of all your needs as you're growing, and your umbilical cord obviously is the thing that is is transferring all those nutrients and all your blood to and from the placenta, and then your amniotic fluid, your amniotic sac, amnion, is there just to protect you from damage and protect you from unequal pressure from acting on the baby. Okay, and it's filled with amniotic fluid. Cool. Yeah. Your placenta, like I think I've described it nice and quickly here. But in more detail, it's there. Antenatal care. Or your prenatal care refers to the period before birth. Antenatal care is the way that a woman should look after herself during pregnancy. You're growing a whole other person. You might need to take in more food, more specific food with like high protein content or high calcium content, because the baby's growing bones and organs and muscles and all these things. So you might need to be taking your irons, supplements. Your folic acid is quite an important one, because if your baby's not getting enough folic acid, your body will give it to it through all what your body would normally use for your hair and your nails. So this is why pregnant women generally go on to quite an intensive course of your prenatal vitamins and minerals, just so that their body gets all that it needs as well. Okay, also, a common sense at this point, a woman should not be drinking or smoking during pregnancy because of this blood barrier. Yes, your baby isn't getting your blood, but it's getting everything that is in your blood. So that means any alcohol or any nicotine or any drugs that are going into your system are also eventually going into your baby. Okay, so yeah, the risk of fetal alcohol syndrome or from drinking, you can go and have a look at the causes of all of these pregnancies. That if you're taking certain drugs, it can be quite detrimental to the baby as it's developing. Okay. Then twins. If you have twins that are formed from two separate eggs, this is where when she releases two or more, this is where you can get fraternal twins, fraternal triplets, or whatever. They are not genetically identical. They are as like one another as brother and sister. And this is where you can get twins that are one boy and one girl, or two girls they might not look identical, but they look as similar to each other as sisters. This means this happens when you have two or more ova being released by a woman in 1 month period, and they still develop together and they're twins, but they're not genetically identical. Another case is when you have identical twins or paternal twins. They actually come from the same egg. During an early stage of cell division, that egg actually separates into two separate eggs, and they both implant into the placenta, into the uterine lining, develop placentas and an amnion. Sometimes they do share that placenta and amnion, but a good number of the times they just form their own. Yeah, so that's the difference between your fraternal and paternal twins or identical twins. And yeah, that's the quick section. Birth, okay. I don't have to get too into birth. Let me just see how. Blah, 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 blah. Birth. Yeah, no, I really, you don't have to go too deep into birth. It's an interesting process, muscle contractions, knowing how long it takes. Like, it generally takes like 38 weeks, which is equivalent to about 9 months. The fact that the baby, its head turns around down towards your cervix, towards the end of development, so that it is ready to be born head first rather than feet first, which is one of the major reasons why you would want to have, or you would need to have a C-section, is if the baby isn't lying correctly. And then the cervix gradually becoming wider to allow for the baby to pass through. It does actually split the pelvis to a certain extent, where it actually breaks it apart. And then baby born, induced birth. You can if it's taking longer than 38 weeks, you can go to a doctor and ask to be artificially stimulated to give birth. And yeah, so that can happen. Comparing your male and female gametes. Yeah, quick little section there. Just make sure that you can distinguish the sperm from an egg cell. This is a question that comes up more in the checkpoint 8 section rather than here, because we assume you can tell the difference between of a male and female gametes. Functions of the placenta and the umbilical cord. As I was saying there, like, yeah, there is this blood barrier that separates the blood that's inside the baby and the blood of the mother, and it is just working through diffusion, that the carbon dioxide and the toxins and the urea passes out, while the oxygen and food passes in. But the blood of the mother and the baby don't actually go through. Yeah, this whole thing with your rubella and your HIV. At this point, a woman can be on antiretrovirals so that they are non-detectable and they won't actually pass HIV onto the baby. And there are ways to ensure that blood barrier doesn't get. You're not transmitting anything viral across that blood barrier. There's ways to ensure that nowadays. Feeding and parental care. It's a huge amount of stuff going on here, and I really don't need to know it in this much detail. I would say have a look at the advantages of breastfeeding over bottle feeding, just for your own sake. It is far more advantageous. You give your baby a bit of immunity through breast milk rather than cow's milk, but nutritionally, that there's not a huge difference. I don't want to say that there's not a huge difference between breastfeeding and using formula or cow's milk, because there is a very big difference, like microbially and immune wise. But the fact is that if a woman needs to be on maybe medication after giving birth, and for some reason is unable to produce enough milk or the right quality of milk to give to their babies, that baby would still be better off taking a formula, taking milk, than not. Yeah, a complicated issue, but yeah, give it a read. It's not part of the syllabus, but if you find it something that you want to be interested in, then for sure. Now, sexual hormones in humans. I went through this with the small kids as well. Again, puberty is largely due to this increase in production of testosterone and estrogen that causes these secondary sexual characteristics to develop in girls and in boys. Please go have a look at what those secondary sexual characteristics are if you're not aware of what they are. But at this stage, I think we are all aware and know about the changes that happen to one's body during puberty. And I think that it is more the influence of sexual hormones in humans is more, it's more important during the menstrual cycle. It's more complicated. Okay. So I'm gonna read through this green bit just so that it's nice and clear. But once you get to know the names of all of these hormones, and you will almost immediately recognize this graph and what happens to all the levels of these hormones at different stages of the menstrual cycle. It becomes the more you hear it, the more familiar it becomes. Okay, so at the start of the cycle, the lining of the uterine wall is broken down. So technically, we start here at menstruation, and this is where the previous month there was no implantation of a fertilized egg, so breakdown of that layer. So that's the start. As each follicle in the ovary develops, so you've got a little follicle that has the potential to become an egg cell and a corpus luteum. We'll get into it now. As each follicle in the ovary develops, the amount of estrogen produced by the ovaries increases. So you can see here, as this little follicle starts to mature, this level of estrogen starts to increase. Okay, and the estrogen acts on the uterus and causes its lining to become thicker and develop more blood vessels. These changes then help an early embryo to implant. So this is where that formation of that uterine lining takes place. Okay. This estrogen, the spike in estrogen, is what is picked up by your pituitary gland in your brain, and that pituitary gland then produces the hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, which is FHS, and that's you can know it just as FHS, and your luteinizing hormone or lutropin, which you can also just know as LH, FSH, and LH. They act on the ripe follicle over here, and they stimulate maturation and the release of the ovum. So this little ovum here, that gets released here where your follicle FSH and your LH are at their peak. And as soon as that leaves, then this corpus luteum, it is what's kind of remaining of your follicle. So this little your egg cell basically gets released here, but this corpus luteum stays in your oviduct, and it has more processes that we'll get into now, but that stays, that remains. One of the ovum has been released, so yeah, then the follicle is what remains, and it develops into a solid body called the corpus luteum. Okay, this produces a hormone called progesterone, which affects the uterine lining in the same way as the estrogen, making it grow thicker and producing more blood vessels. So basically what happens here is your corpus luteum, while it's still in place, it spikes your progesterone, and this elevated level of progesterone is what maintains the conditions for a pregnancy to take place. So it maintains this high level of progesterone, which maintains the lining in your uterus. And if you were to become pregnant and there was implantation of a fertilized ovum, then your placenta actually takes over the role of keeping that progesterone level high. Okay, so yeah, so that's your corpus luteum over here. If the ovum is fertilized, the corpus luteum continues to release progesterone and keeps the uterus in a sustainable for implantation. If the ovum is not fertilized, the corpus luteum starts producing progesterone, and as a result, the thickened lining of the uterus breaks down and loses blood, which escapes through the cervix and vagina, The events in the menstrual cycle are shown in figure 16.58, which I think is this. Yeah. So yeah, this knowing when the spikes of each one of these hormones are at, and knowing what each one is and what's happening at each, it is a bit overwhelming at this stage, but please make sure that you're very familiar with this diagram because it explains it very, very well and shows you all the parts that are involved at each stage in this cycle. And yeah, so just these spikes will become very familiar when you see them in exams because it won't be exactly this graph, but you might see a similar pattern in what's happening here, and being able to recognize that pattern in the different hormones is important for this process. Okay. Then we talk about quickly here menopause, that between the ages of 40 and 55, generally the ovaries cease to release ova or produce hormones, so the ova run out in a sense, and as a consequence the menstrual cycle ceases and women can no longer have children. Yeah, no, this all becomes, menopause is often talked about very negatively, but it sometimes happens much later on in life. 45 is not necessarily the end, but yeah, there is a point at which women stop being able to produce eggs, whereas we will be producing sperm our whole lives. It's because that men are able to produce new sperm, whilst women are born with all the eggs that they have. It's a different process. Methods of birth control, again, not really sexual hormones here, sexually transmitted diseases. Birth control, not in the syllabus, but please, for your own sake, please familiarize yourself with all the different means of birth control. I think it's very important to know the differences and the different options that are out there, because so often we are not given those options and we don't know about them. So please, if not for your syllabus or any part of like the reading that needs to happen, just do it for your own benefit. Here, that's all part of a fertility treatment. Sexually transmitted diseases. So this is in your syllabus, STIs, but preventing STIs can be done through a lot of these different contraceptive methods. There's a lot of ways like your contraceptive pills and your chemicals methods. They aren't necessarily going to be effective against STIs. The most effective one against STIs is going to be your sheaths or condoms, your physical barriers. But yeah, just make sure that you know that. Like if you're on contraceptive injections, contraceptive pills, it's not going to fight against STIs. It's only going to be effective against pregnancy and not always 100% guaranteed. But just keep that in mind. Looking at STIs, the one most spoken about is your AIDS and HIV, which is a immunovirus that has become very prevalent in especially our country. South Africa has been on one of the biggest campaigns to prevent the spread and debilitation caused by the disease HIV. And we've got a really good system these days. Like your antiretrovirals they can be given out by the government, and yeah, these days, please please be responsible and try not to catch an STI. But at this point, most of them will not affect your life in a noticeable way for the most part. Okay. So yeah, just practicing safe sexual practices is kind of the end of the day what they want you to know from HIV and this whole section on sexually transmitted infections. But I always think it is not, you can't really effectively discuss STIs without discussing your contraceptives. So please go back and have a look at those sections. They're not in your syllabus, but they are important to know about. Okay, and and that is where I'm going to leave you. I'd like you to complete all of these questions for next week Thursday. No, well, let's say do up until, yeah, do your core questions for Thursday, and then you can do your extended questions for next week Monday. But I will definitely send this as an email as well, so that if you don't listen to the very end of the video, you will still know about the homework. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I hope this has been informative. It is a very big chapter, so please make sure that you are making thorough notes. Keep that syllabus right by you. And yeah, I will speak to you again soon.